Is Luigi's Mansion 2 HD just a quick cash grab for Nintendo? With the game's release imminent on June 27th for the Nintendo Switch, fans are split. Are we getting a true upgrade, or are we just getting a slightly polished repackage of an old game? Unfortunately, it's looking like it might be the latter. But before we go straight into the Switch version of the game, let's look at the source material, the original Luigi's Mansion 2 Dark Moon for the Nintendo 3DS. The original game came out on March 20th of 2013 to mixed reviews. By all means, the game wasn't terrible, it just fans didn't feel like it lived up to the original, which is common with sequels. However, the original also didn't start off on the best foot. Although the game is very beloved now, at the time it just wasn't what people were expecting. Nintendo used Luigi's Mansion as a launch title for the GameCube. And the original idea wasn't necessarily bad, it's just everybody was expecting his brother with a brand new 3D platformer. The GameCube did eventually get a 3D Mario game with Super Mario Sunshine, and eventually the tables turned and people started to really grow fond of Luigi's Mansion. But what made the original so special was the atmosphere. The game's eerie and unique atmosphere, enhanced by its lighting and ghost designs, set it apart and created a memorable experience. And another thing that set the original apart was the art style. With a more subtle and detailed ghost design, along with the iconic portrait ghosts, it really contributed to its visual charm. But unlike the original, there's not as many people that changed their opinion about the game. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's some people out there that will absolutely defend this game, but for many, the changes made in the sequel was just a bit too much for their liking. One of the first changes in Luigi's Mansion 2 is instead of having one mansion, there's 5, which at the surface seems like a great idea and lots of fun, but in practice it wasn't quite the same. Because although there might have been 5 times more mansions than the original, the mansions were smaller. And whereas in the original you were encouraged to explore all of the mansion, in Luigi's Mansion 2 Dark Moon, it was mission based. So you would go into a mansion, complete the mission, get out of there, rinse, recycle, repeat with all the mansions. Another difference in Luigi's Mansion 2 is the lack of portrait ghosts. The portrait ghosts were the bosses in the original, and it's not to say there were no bosses. There were definitely bosses in Luigi's Mansion 2, but they were quite underwhelming. In the original, it was quite clear when you were up against a common ghost or when you were up against a portrait ghost. But in the sequel, some of the bosses and common ghosts were barely distinguishable. And the last dissatisfaction, I guess you could say, is about the controls. But this problem isn't necessarily about the game itself, it's more about the console it's on. The game required you to look up and down to solve some of the puzzles, but because the 3DS did not have a second analog stick, the developers of the game had to get creative. To look up, you pressed the X button, and to look down, you pressed the B button. But there's an issue with that. The X button is a very commonly used button because it's the button you use to go into doors, whereas the B button is also a very used button because it's the button you click to run, which leads to a lot of frustrating situations where you want Luigi to go into a door, but instead he just kind of looks up. So now that we have our reference point, now let's look at the Switch HD port that's about to come out. But before we dive in, I have a very short message. If this is your first time here, hey, my name's Acadrien and I post weekly Nintendo videos. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, please consider liking and subscribing, and without further ado, let's go right back into the video. Ever since the original reveal of this game, there was always something that wasn't sitting right with people. There was just something about it that smelled cheap. Something that definitely does not help this game out, it's comparing it to Luigi's Mansion 3. I don't think it's necessarily a fair comparison, but I also don't blame people for comparing them. But it is to keep in mind that Luigi's Mansion 3 is a Switch game made for Switch, whereas Luigi's Mansion 2 HD is a 3DS game being ported and upscaled to Switch. And I saw a lot of people call the game ugly, and honestly, to each their own, everybody's entitled to their own opinion about it. I don't think the game looks great. It definitely doesn't look as good as Luigi's Mansion 3, but it definitely also looks better than the original. But personally, the way I look at it is even if it doesn't look as good as Luigi's Mansion 3, there's still other ways the game can make up for it. For instance, since Switch does have a second analog stick, people can look forward to updated controls. However, I don't think I would advise people to look forward to those updated controls because they did not implement them. But hear me out, it's a budget title, right? So even if they didn't want to, completely remake the assets from the ground up to make the game look just as great as Luigi's Mansion 3 does, that is completely understandable. But it's crazy to me that they didn't even bother updating the camera controls, and that to me makes it feel like this game had a really fast development. And here's the weirdest part for me. Even if they didn't bother to change the controls, that's one thing, as long as you leave us, the player, a chance to do it in the settings. But they didn't even do that. You have to play with the exact same control method as the 3DS. So you're again forced to use a just really awkward control scheme. But again, I get it, they're cutting corners because it's a budget title, right? Right? Nope. Nope. This is a full price game. Nintendo put this at full price. Meaning you're going to have Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and Luigi's Mansion 3 sitting side by side at the store for the exact same price. But hear me out, there's still one more thing that Nintendo could have done. Just one last thing that to me would have at least made it feel slightly better of a deal. And that is to include some bonus content. To which, spoiler alert, they have not. Hear me out, Nintendo has ported plenty and plus games during this console generation. And not all of them, don't get me wrong, not all of them, but a good chunk of them have extra content associated with them. For example, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe had all the DLC for Mario Kart 8. And if you look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, they had a whole additional DLC that was created with the game for Futures Connected. But my personal favorite port we got on Switch was Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. Oh man, Bowser's Fury was so good. And once again, everybody's entitled to their own opinion about this, but for me personally, I feel like Nintendo flubbed at every single corner and opportunity they had with this game. First, choosing the black sheep of the franchise to bring over was definitely a choice. Plus, I kind of find it weird that they chose to have Luigi's Mansion 2 and 3 on Switch, but not the original. I can definitely see a more casual Nintendo fan who doesn't understand this to get confused on why they can find Luigi's Mansion 2 in store, 3 in store, but for whatever reason, Luigi's Mansion 1 is never in stock. Of course, me, and I imagine most people watching this video, of course, understand why Luigi's Mansion 1 isn't in stock, because it doesn't exist for Switch, but you understand where I'm coming from though, right? And I also do understand that there's only a limited amount of things that Nintendo can do with Luigi's Mansion 2 to try to make it better, and for a lot of the complaints that the game got, it does require almost like a reimagining of the game, but come on, the bare minimum they could have done was adjust the controls. But let's circle all the way back to the beginning to my original question. Is Luigi's Mansion 2 HD a scam? No, I don't think it's quite a scam, but boy, does it ever feel scummy. But now I toss the question back to you. Do you think Luigi's Mansion 2 HD is worth the price? Let me know down in the comments. And as I mentioned earlier, if you guys enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider liking and subscribing, and until next time, Warao.